E ngai weo te motu tēnā koutou katoa me ngā mihi ki o tātou tini mate ki o tātou tini aituā. Huri tū mai ki a tātou kei tau marama. Ti he wa mauri ora ki a tātou katoa. Kia ora. Good afternoon and welcome back again to Māpuna as we approach the last weeks of 2024. A year in which Māoridom farewelled some of our most prominent leaders, including King Ituheitia. Also the last surviving member of the 28 Māori Battalion, Tā Bom Gillies. And just this week, Joe Glenn, a veteran of the Special Air Services and a reporter for TVNZ's Te Karere for a number of years. But we can take some solace that new leaders and thinkers have emerged. And my guest today is certainly shaping up as one of them. He studied at Harvard, where he examined the indigenous experiences of settler colonialism in Aotearoa. In America, he has a PhD from the Australian National University, a bachelor's degree in Māori studies from Otago University, and he's a director at Pounamu Consulting in Porneke, Wellington, which took part in a series of major reports into bias in policing and its effects on Māori and Pacifica communities. Now, next year, he will be Victoria University's emerging Māori writer in residence. He is Dr. Pounamu Jade Aikman, no Ngāti Maniapoto, Ngāti Wairere, Ngāti Apakura, Ngāti Awa, Ngai Tarangi, Ngāti Tarawhai, Te Arawa, Ngāti Wenu Kukopako. I hope I've got all the karangatanga iwi in there, and I can tell you he's a pretty handy singer as well. E te tākuta Pounamu tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe, tēnā koe. Thank you for having me on.
I hope you don't mind about the singing bit, but I have it on good authority, that's true.
Indeed.
we can get into that. But I don't mind, I wanted to start, and I hope you don't mind me doing this. Despite all your northern iwi whakapapa, that you spent some early years in Timaru.
That's right. I moved around. We as a whānau moved around with Mum following her mahi wherever she was. So that took us from Gisborne, where I went to Kohanga, up to Tamaki, then to Otoitahi down in Christchurch, and then down to Timaru because my grandparents retired in a small kind of village just down the road from there called Waimate. And so we moved back to Timaru, which is just down the road, so we could be closer to my nan and koro in their final years, I suppose. And that's kind of the journey into there. And then I did my college years there before I moved to Dunedin for university.
Timaru's an interesting place. I spent a bit of time down there when I was at Ngaitahu. It's got its own feel, eh?
It does, and I think when I think of my upbringing, I'm really privileged to have been supported by a particularly committed set of teachers at my primary school, Grant Lee, and for them, they really encouraged a curiosity about the world around us and encouraged you and nurtured you to be able to think and also rewarded you for being critical and reflective. And that, in conjunction with Mum really emphasising that music and learning different languages was a key part of growing up, kind of led me into wanting to do more study at university through to eventually to finishing my PhD.
How would you describe your kind of understanding and knowledge of your own whakapapa? Your cultural understanding at that time?
It's a good question, I think, because a lot of our whānau today grow up away from their hokainga, and that's not a choice we have made. That is the result of, myriad different forces, and colonisation, underlying all of that, but also urbanisation in the 1950s. And so for me, growing up and having my college years in the South Island, you are a bit distanced from, where your hokainga is. And that's an experience that a lot of our whānau have been through. But it's not to say that those links are diminished by any means. But it does mean that sometimes that reconnecting can be a bit challenging. And I know that, whānau of mine have had that kind of experience where even though our hokaingas, waikatoroturua, whakatane tauranga moana, living away from there, again, because of just things, we have to work and we have to live where we can, where our parents and stuff can get work, means that we're a little bit more disconnected. But I think in today's world, what I have been really privileged by is that, being manaaked by Kaitahu and Katihuirapa down in Te Tihi o Maru, which has made that connection, more real for me growing up there, but also recognising where I'm from up home. So it's a reality that, a lot of our whānau share, but I'm privileged because, when I go home, and I also recognise that going home to our hokainga is a challenging task because, the cost of living is really expensive, travel is really expensive. But within all of that, though, recognising those links, and that I suppose we, outside of our control, these forces have played into our lives. But what's exciting is to be able to reconnect, acknowledging as well the privilege I have of being able to do so, because our whānau are facing a lot of things today, and today te ao huri nei, and I'm privileged to be able to do that. And that's kind of, it's a tension sometimes understanding that, but for me is one that, is just part of being Māori in the 21st century here in Aotearoa.
Yeah, and this is something I hear a lot from people about, the privilege of being able to come to understand and get access to knowledge, to be able to reinforce and re-entrench, I guess, those ancestral ties, learn language and tikanga and that kind of thing. And I also hear people say, yep, it is a privilege, but it is a right, it is a cultural right to be able to do so. And the issue is that sometimes sometimes we fail to understand and recognise that it is our right. And yes, resources become an issue, but everyone, whether they be from wherever they come from, whatever their whakapapa might be as Māori, has the right to be able to learn and understand and grow their own understanding of themselves.
Absolutely, and I think we do ourselves a disservice as Aotearoa, ahakoa no wai, ko wai, if we make those paths more difficult to access. I know resources is a part of that, but also just the ability to see that this is not a threat, engaging with not just, whakapapa tikanga, but also within, broadly speaking, indigenous knowledge systems. And I think our tupuna would lament if they saw how, or if they see how, the just understandings of our cosmos from indigenous, from Māori and hapu and iwi perspectives can be seen in an unfavourable light. And what, for me, that does is dismisses a really demonstrated history right throughout the 19th century of rangatira Māori engaging eagerly with te ao huri at their time and te ao Pākehā. And so while recognising, just in response to your prompt there, the challenges that have happened, I think it's also important to reiterate that this is not really when we're engaging in these kinds of connecting to our whakapapa, to our tikanga, and all of what that means in terms of indigenous knowledge and Māori knowledge systems, it's an opportunity to enhance the beauty and diversity of our wonderful Aotearoa in a way that encourages the prosperity of all. And I think that's what our rangatira we're really keenly aware of, is that there's we can prosper together when we see how those links of whakapapa, of trade and commerce can be beneficial for all.
Yeah, I think that's what people fail to kind of grasp. When we, review things like Te Tiri Tō Waitangi, the comments made at the signing at so many sites as well, not just at Waitangi but at others, and certainly from my own experience where my ancestors were, when they talked about hara mai e te kāwana hei hoa. Now people have translated that as friend, or as an associate or as a colleague, but obviously at the time thinking about things like bartering and in trade. So, hara mai hei hoa is, yes, about a companion, but also to explore opportunities. And I think that's something else that we sometimes forget, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think with that extension of aroha, to frame it in terms of hoa, that comes with obligation as well. That comes with a sense of reciprocity between rangatira and rangatira, and understanding that, again, our mutual prosperity comes from those kinds of partnerships. But we see it, we do ourselves a disservice by tying ourselves up in knots around distortions of what we understand our rangatira to have said. Because I think at the end of the day, they saw a world within which they wanted to actively participate in, and as rangatira of the time, they wanted to be involved in that. And so I think it's an ongoing challenge, and it can be difficult to have those kinds of kōrero today. But when I read and engage in history, I'm continually reminded of that, and that mauri still passes down today to our tamariki mokopuna rangatahi in articulating what that looks like for them today.
How do you explain it, though, Takuta, when the argument, again, at this point, is that we are talking about a separate class of rights, a separate class of interests, which in a Western liberal democratic society should not exist, which has an approach that everyone is equal?
It's always a challenging point that's often raised. I think what that does is yes, there, we are our constitution is built on democratic representation, but also, there have been times in history, globally and in Aotearoa, where different legal systems, perhaps, have been in existence, such as, or even briefly, so within Tūhoe, for example, Te rohe pōtai o Tūhoe was, recognised in law, but as its kind of separate own autonomous entity where their own mana and rangatiratanga governed what Tūhoe and Te Urewera looked like. I think what's happened, though, is over time as we've transitioned into understandings of, the right of the individual over everything else is important, in that the emphasis on equality can overshadow the nuances of our histories. And we had an example of a solution where you had this autonomous region through the Urewera Native District Reserve Act, which Judith Binney explores significantly across her corpus of research and shows that it is possible. But when we talk about things, like democratic representation, those aspects are important. And I think what I'm emphasising, especially in a book that I'm currently working on, is that these multiple ideas, ways of understanding can coexist together. But when you have a kōrero on the pie where everyone is shouting at one another and we're unable to hear clarity in that, it can muddy and make it difficult to understand. There are multiple ways of seeing things, of understanding, what it means to grow up in Aotearoa today that doesn't repudiate or invalidate other ways of being. My concern is that we're becoming a little bit more like that, which again does a massive disservice to our own demonstrated histories in Aotearoa.
You say we are becoming more like that. Who's the we that you are talking about?
I think it applies across all. I think there's aspects of it, in global trends, but here at home as well. I'm rhetoric that is unhelpful, that distorts what did or did not happen in our history. Becomes increasingly part of a debate that where the rangatira ethic of balancing, different perspectives with one another is not present, and social media is recognised, unfortunately, as a way that inflames particular perspectives without offering a counter, without offering he kōrero hei whakautu. And with that, when that rangatira ethic is not present, it means that people can become, amplified in rage and in their own perspectives of what is or what isn't happening. But what it does, it further divides. And, we are too small to be a divided nation. And I think we have examples in our history of showing shared prosperity again. But it's concerning when especially with the events of recent weeks, to see, rhetoric, inflammatory to the extent of being dislocated from our own historical foundations, which is important. That's why, understanding our past and how it exists in the present is really important.
I'm really glad you brought up the Urewera example, because from my understanding, and I hope I'm right on this, the Urewera is still the only place in Aotearoa that has under a settlement process, has actively removed Crown title. And I also think, and again I hope I'm right, that it was the first place that kind of had that legally, that approach of personhood being put on an area. Say, for example, the same as Whanganui River, Maunga Taranaki. Now, these are two really interesting, or lots of interesting things for me. First of all, the removal of Crown title in a place like Urewera reflects that history that you talk about. But it also allows space for further conversation in what we're talking about now, about the ability for people to be able to self-govern, self-manage. I know we've talked, people talk about co-management, particularly on the Waikato River. But self-management, self-governance, where the argument seems to be that cannot happen within a sovereign nation, and yet internationally, takuta, that's not the case, right? That exists, and there are examples where that exists overseas. So uruwera provides the opportunity for that to also exist.
Exactly, and I think, as you identify, it's an opportunity to have that discussion, and these forms of working in partnership with communities at an iwi level, such as you describe, with personhood of te uruwera, is a really powerful opportunity to have that conversation, but to also see how iwi and hapu, who have existed on their whenua for myriad generations, are intimately aware of the ecological nature of their homelands and what works well and what doesn't in terms of management of ancestral estates. And I've done a lot of work in my consulting company, going around and talking with whānau from different places, and often they'll talk about things like how, if they've partnered with council, they've been able to identify how, for example, a particular area in their rohe is prone to flooding, and so putting a housing development or putting some kind of infrastructure there might not work as well. So what that is really from any perspective is expertise that can support what good governance at local levels. And I suppose as you say, it shows that it's not an either or. We get stuck in these binaries of it has to be this way or it has to be that way in terms of what we understand our constitution to be. But it also, I think, a bigger part there is inviting into the conversation that we can find, even within the legal frameworks of Aotearoa at the moment, almost this threshold, this space between to be able to have coexisting authorities. And what Dame Judith Binney's research emphasised is that this has occurred before in the kind of the late 19th century with Tūhoe, who had that enshrined in the Uruwera District Native Reserve Act. That was the intent of that to provide legal autonomy for Tūhoe was really intended by the Premier, Richard Seddon, at the time. It was undone quickly, unfortunately, by successive governments. But it goes to show that in our own histories, that shows that kind of partnership can work, but also to leverage local knowledge around place when you've got iwi and hapu who are, like local government, are enduring features of our beautiful whenua and have knowledge of the whenua itself, which can be harnessed in ways that encourage, prosperity, but also looking after our communities, especially in times of climate crises.
You say that you've worked with a lot of places where it sounds to me like you're just trying to provide space for good, robust and helpful conversations to exist between parties, whether it be councils and others, or even in between iwi or iwi with others, whatever the process may be. Is it getting harder to be able to have those conversations, to allow that space for those kind of helpful discussions to occur? And if so, why?
That's a really good pātai. I think it's a bit of a mix of both. When I find, and having worked with local governments in a few areas, I've seen a palpable desire to want to work in a more collaborative way, and there is a genuine desire that exists. However, in saying that, there are other perspectives that don't see that as an important way of how governance should work in Aotearoa. And again, I think it comes back to seeing that this is not a threat to see the potential of working together, and also that could mitigate expenses or significant expenditure that could otherwise be more effectively used by harnessing local knowledge. So it's a bit of a mix there. So so many of the whānau I've worked with at a hapu level, as well as local government, have shown this strong desire to work in partnership. I think, though, when there is misconceptions about what one or the other is doing in terms of mana whenua, for example, in relation to a local government, that's when we get stuck in te pō, when we're like, oh, they're here to, if a more un-Manaki way of interpreting what is happening in our communities, then that's what holds us in te pō, and to be like, okay, are we coming from a place of, evidence of kōrero, or are we kind of reverting to stereotypes of what our communities are doing? And again, that holds us all in te pō. And for me, I have whakapapa in as much to Europe, to Kōtirana Scotland, in as much as I do here, and it's just not as binary as some of the kōrero I see today. And it's again an opportunity to see, hey, we've been doing this for a long time, and we can still do it in a really wonderful way in future. And that's not to say that there will be hostile kōrero, because, the pā and in front of our wharenui is a place of that heated kōrero, which has been, an ethic going way back for our communities ancestrally. So those kōrero do happen, but the rangatira ethic is to bring in, what about this kind of kōrero, or have you considered this? When we're able to do that, and that's often what I'm more trying to do in my kind of work and the kaupapa that I take on, to see value in that and to be like, okay, I hear that. What would you say with regards to this over here, for instance? Yeah.
I actually wasn't intending on asking you all of these questions, by the way, but you've kind of graciously led me there. So the next question I'm going to ask, I think just follows on from what we've been talking about, although it's related to other issues that are happening at the time. When it comes to a founding document like Te Tiri Te Waitangi, how, Tākuta, would you lead us in that conversation as a nation? What needs to happen?
I think a critical part there is understanding that we have fundamentally different versions of the treaty and te tiriti. And they do say different things, and he mana no te kupu. So there's weight and integrity in words. So when people say, rangatira, ceded sovereignty, they are talking from the English version. And a literal reading of that would show that to be the case. But at the same time, te tiriti, the translation which the majority of rangatira at the time signed, says a very different thing. And it talks about a form of subordinate authority through what we call today as kāwanatanga. Now, those two things are very, very different and nuanced, and there's lots of debates that have emerged in terms of what does sovereignty mean today, or how do we interpret or understand what sovereignty was understood as back then, and what was the mana behind all of this. What holds us back constantly in te pō is either coming from one version or the other. So when you have when people across the pie are shouting, you ceded sovereignty, and then in the Te Reo Māori version, something very different is said. For me, it comes from understanding that both of those things can exist as truths alongside one another, but they do say very different things, and they do lay the foundations for very different frameworks of existence that have unfolded here. For me, if we don't do that, if we don't engage in a kōrero like that, we're risking being stuck in te pō, and then that's when hostility and more unmanaki ways of interpreting things come about. And within that is the importance of teaching our histories to our tamariki and mokopuna to understand that. And again, it is a really fundamental aspect of the debates around Te Tiriti and the Treaty of Waitangi today, and it's just more can we agree that these different ways of articulating the vision that rangatira at the time had, so that we can move into a space of, so what do we do next? What can we, with the understanding of that, what are the next steps for our communities and for Aotearoa as a whole? But the more conversation is directed into cession or not cession of sovereignty, the more we get stuck in te pō without realising there's a lot more out there. And again, I'd go back to emphasising we're too small as a whānau, as a community here in Aotearoa, to have these kinds of divisions. And imagine the beauty that we already see in Aotearoa that could be in the Aopopo if we're able to push through that. But unfortunately, time and again, that has been the mainstay of some aspects of political rhetoric saying Māori ceded sovereignty, and I understand that, where those are coming from, and they're speaking from their own tūranga wai way of truth for them. And there's mana in that, and we have to recognise that, and that's part of, bringing into the conversation rather than, solidifying a binary of this way or that way.
couple of things for me, and I want to applaud you for your use of the academic term anmanaki. Nō reira tēnā koe. Tēnā koe. But secondly, you've talked a lot about the how and the what. What I'm wondering is, what about the who? So you've talked about what the how looks like in terms of how we have the conversation and potentially what the process of that could be. But who should lead that conversation?
That's a good question, and if I can kind of step into my police research that I've just done, we would, for about 2.5 years, we were working with and alongside our blue whānau, our uniform whānau, and that started off at the police college in Porirua, following what they call a recruit wing, through from the day they got off the bus through to their graduation at the Te Rau Paraha Arena in Porirua. And when I was there, what I saw was, this palpable passion and commitment for change and to serve community. And when it came to responsiveness to Māori and Pasifika and other ethnic communities, all of the recruits that I spoke with were like, we want to do well in manakiing our communities, but they don't necessarily know how to do that. So New Zealand histories as they are at the moment are not always taught in what is called an operational lens. So Te Tiriti happened, 1840, colonisation happened thereafter. What does that mean for me as a new constable hitting ground in the district, in districts that I'm deployed to, when I start my mahi from start to finish? What does that mean? And so what I emphasised in my report, He Kitinga no Te Whare, Insights from the Whare, was to try and emphasise by saying, we've got all these ideas around, cultural responsiveness, equity, and te tiriti, but we need to do the next step of showing and this is where the who part of your question comes in, for new officers hitting the ground, what does it mean to them to enact these kinds of principles? And what I emphasised is that we need to have role and rank examples. So a constable, which is the first tohu that you get as an officer, is going to be very different to the way, in terms of engagement with communities from in Māori and Pasifika communities. That's going to be different, for example, from a superintendent. So a superintendent is more at the senior level management in a district or an area. And so what I saw was, again, this real desire to know what to do with our history, and the police college is already doing some of that. But I think there's an opportunity to continue that learning, to show how the who, so for example, in terms of constables who are, landing in Rotorua or Tauranga or wherever else, to know what does this mean in practice, and we can give them just some examples to think about what could this look like. Could it look like working with church community leaders, or could it look like working more closely with a kāhui kaumātua in this particular community, and so on and so forth. When we break it down into the pragmatics, I've found there's been really good responses by our blue whānau to be like, okay, so that's what that means, because sometimes our kōrero around cultural responsiveness, equity and te tiriti can exist more in the theoretical domain without translating it down into pragmatic aspects of mahi in everyday life. And so for blue whānau who are working with our communities, and in some communities, some of our whānauing communities who are really distressed, they want to know, so what does this mean? The so what? And that's where the who aspect comes in. So linking together the what and the how, by showing pragmatic examples for, in the case of our blue whānau that are new constables in districts, so that they're like, okay, so that's what this means in terms of my own constabulary practice. The other thing in there, and this goes back to my kōrero about being stuck in te pō, I tried to write the report and to present my findings in a way that was whakamaneing, was elevating everyone, and not trying to pull everyone into a feeling of guilt about our past, because that's unproductive and that kind of thing holds us in te pō. It's more like, what can we do? And so if we can show, for example, what constables can do when they land in their districts, you're showing them, you're translating those big kōrero around equity and cultural responsiveness into actionable practice when they land in wherever they're going across Aotearoa.
You're listening to Māpuna on RNZ National. Our guest is Dr. Pounamu Jade Aikman. Tākuta, you will or are releasing a book of essays titled Whose Knowledge Counts? From Warp Drive to Wakahuia, published, I think, by Bridget Williams Books. You're going to explore the tension between indigenous and settler knowledge systems, focusing on the question of whose knowledge is prioritised in Aotearoa today. Very easy question. Whose knowledge is prioritised in Aotearoa today, and why?
Oh, for the easy part, Ihua. I think it's a good question, and I think we're conducting this interview primarily in English, and that's a reflection because knowledge is embedded in reo. But at the same time, there are lots of aspects of te ao Māori that exist within English as well. I remember when I was down doing an automotive engineering course down at Otago Polytechnic, one of my favourite years of study as I was finishing my master's. And I remember hearing one of my lecturers, an older Pākehā kind of kaumātua in automotive engineering, and he said, don't do a half-pay job. And I remember thinking, that's what my grandparents used to use, and we kind of use that a bit. But when I asked him, did he understand where that came from, he was like, not really, I just kind of said it all the time. And this is with our whānau down in Aotearoa in Dunedin. And so it shows that we have this cross-pollination, but at the same time, certain ways of knowing have been prioritised at the expense of others. And what my whole kind of purpose of wanting to write this book was to show that, again, as I've kind of said earlier, indigenous knowledges and Māori knowledge systems should not be seen as a threat by virtue of them being indigenous ways of understanding the cosmos. And there's opportunities there to see all these crossovers and how we might understand and see the world around us. What I'm interested in is, how that plays out in, the national conversation, in as much as it does in everyday life, because there are certain ways of knowing and understanding that are prioritised over others. And that can look like, for example, our approach to health, our approach to haura, for example, in as much as it does the reo that we use, and what that kind of says in terms of, for example, understanding our histories and what our histories show, or how our historical narratives can promote particular ways of knowing and being at the expense of others. And it's not a binary either or. Again, it's very much a flow between these different kinds of ways of knowing. And again, what I wanted to emphasize and what I'll be doing in the book is saying there's, this all offers a koha really to show there's lots of ways of knowing. And an example I gave the other day on another interview was what we see as matariki in the skies is also known as Pleiades by other whānau in the world, and also in Japan is known as Subaru. But that doesn't make any less real or less true the stellar phenomenon you're looking at the sky. What it is to say, though, is that one way of understanding sometimes dominates, and it's that tension that I'm interested in exploring.
And if the idea, or if the principle behind all of this foundationally, is the intergenerational transmission of knowledge, or maybe that's not the point. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe if you look at it from a kōrero tukui ho Māori perspective, the whole idea is to continue on that generation of knowledge intergenerationally, that transmission of knowledge intergenerationally. Whereas, potentially, and this may be a very kind of coded, biased way of looking at universities and politics, for example, as an asset that can be commodified. Can those two things exist in the same time in a set of institutions as they are currently established? Now, Takuta, please don't see this as an attack on you because you are an academic.
No, not at all.
But attached to an institution. But the idea is that if you have one fundamental approach, which is intergenerational transmission of knowledge, for the ongoing benefit of communities, as opposed to a commodified asset that people can purchase and acquire and therefore learn something. Can those two sets of things exist at the same time in our current institutions such as they are?
It's a great pathway. I think they can because they do. And also I think it's emphasising around where we see knowledge coming from. So formal academies, universities, for example, are one way of transmitting knowledge, but knowledge often begins, between kuia and mokopuna, for example. Just talking and singing waiata and those kinds of things, that's a form of knowledge transmission. So it's understanding that universities are one space, but they're very limited in what they do and the kinds of knowledge they support. And they do also support, these other forms of knowledge that I'm talking about. But it's for me, it's saying that that is one platform. The home is also a very powerful platform where we're talking and having kōrero around our shared histories, what that might mean for our tamariki and mokopuna, and understanding, for example, we don't do that thing here because we learnt this lesson a long time ago, or it could be we do this practice here because we learnt in our next to our awa, this works particularly well. So I think it's that there's that is also a tension that you're identifying. But for me, it's like, well, there are multiple places where knowledge is practiced and transmitted, and being on I was with my partner down in Tahuna recently, and we were planting some plants on their whenua there, and that is a form of knowledge as well. That linking to whenua of understanding, what plants are going to do well in this particular climate. That's a space of learning, in as much as it is at university, and of course, because university is a particular style of learning and a particular way of understanding that is not the only or exclusive platform of knowledge, of practice, and of transmitting that.
I've got so many other questions I want to ask, and we're going to run out of time. And a lot of it's coming. By the way, just run that by me. Did you do a mechanics course? Did you do a mechanics course at the same time you were finishing your masters?
Yeah, I did. I did.
What's wrong with you?
Yeah, I know, right? I know. It's been far too long. But I think where that comes from is, again, I have a curiosity about knowledge, and I was studying at Otago with some friends of mine, and we drove up north to Blenheim for some kaupapa, and something went wrong with the car, and I remember thinking, I have no idea. This is a reo I do not speak, because I'm pretty hopeless in practical endeavours. And at that point, I was like, I need to make a change. So then the Otago University campus is right next to the Otago Polytech campus. Yeah. And so I literally walked across the road one day and went into the automotive engineering workshop and said, I'd like to do this course. What do I need to do? And so for the final year of my master's degree, I was also studying, entry-level automotive engineering. And for me, I just loved, understanding, so what does all this mean? How do you understand the mechanics of a vehicle, and how does chemical energy transfer into mechanical energy, and all of that kind of stuff. That comes from a curiosity, but also being like, I don't know how to look after my waka properly, so how can this be a way of actually learning about that? So it comes to it's a curiosity of knowledge that I've had for a long time, and again, that's a space where knowledge is taught and imparted. And what I loved about Polytech, it's a very different style of learning, very tuakana taina. So when I was there in the workshops, very, very tuakana taina, very small kind of class groups, working through the practical assessments of engine rebuild and disassembly and rebuild, and all the way through to the more theoretical stuff like energy and all that kind of stuff.
So, I loved it. You just academically broke it down. You took a very academic approach into.
Indeed.
I thought the short answer would be, as the now appointed Te Herenga Waka Victoria University of Wellington International Institute of Modern Letters and Creative New Zealand Emerging Māori Writer in Residence for 2025, that you're able to get a new car as a part of the grant, and then make sure you just get it warranted at Regoed and check it out every 6 months. That's what I thought the answer would be. But no, fair enough. But the thing you said about curiosity, right? Where does that come from?
Really good pātai. It's my mum, who's one of my greatest role models, and she always, as kids, she wanted us to go to kohanga, so I went to kohanga in the 90s. She wanted us, my baby sister and I, to be surrounded by music. She wanted us to learn, so I learnt the piano and the saxophone while I was at primary school and college. And then also, as I mentioned before, I had a particularly committed set of teachers at Grant Lee, my primary school in Timaru, where I kind of did my intermediate years, who again rewarded you for thinking curiously and thinking outside the box. So Mum really emphasised that, and my nan, my grandma as well, and encouraging that kind of curiosity and being like, so why is the sky blue? And why is grass green? Those are profound pātai that have really complex answers, but we should encourage those kinds of pātai in our kids today. And that curiosity has been like, so what do cars do? And that's how I kind of got down that track. But it's also seeing, for me, around acknowledging, those kind of supports that have come through. And, I went to a relatively low decile school in Timaru, but committed kaitiaki, committed teachers. And I always talk about Mrs. Leonard, who was my Year 7 teacher, who I still keep in touch with today. And she was part of that Māori, part of that journey, as well as Mum kind of always supporting us. And that's kind of led me through to all the different things that I've been interested across my academic career.
They must have, all of them must have been chuffed when you received your doctorate and graduated.
Yeah, it was a privilege to be able to recognise, and there's truth in e hara taku toa te toa takatini, e toa takitahi kia, that collective that contributes to that. And I always think of how my whānau, my communities that have supported me across to be able to do all that I have, because and that's how we see it. Looking after our tamariki, and that's what I see today. I'm on the board of there's one kura Māori in South Canterbury, and our wonderful tamariki are here in Pōneke at the moment doing a bit of exploring around Te Papa, and that's a way of also encouraging. I see that today. We were just in Te Papa, and I saw that curiosity within them, and nurturing that and encouraging that is part of what it is for us today.
That collective approach that you talk about, that toa takitini approach, is that what you drive for in terms of solutions? And by the way, academics are always accused of being ethereal. And it's about the theory of things and all that kind of stuff. So is the collective thing also what drives what you're doing in academia when you're trying to find community-based solutions, is a phrase I hear all the time. Yeah. But is that part of the driving thing to get to an outcome, that we must try and find community collective-based solutions in any kind of academic research that we're doing? Is that one of the main messages, Taukuta?
Absolutely. And I think it's for me, the emphasis on speaking in an accessible way, so that kia ngāwari te reo. Koro always used to say, kia ngāwari tō reo. Make it simple so that you're, in speaking in te reo, but also in English. And I often felt, when I was at university, a bit alienated by the way we talk about, those ethereal theories that you kind of mentioned, and that encourages that way of being that can be quite distant. And so when I taught at university, both at Te Herenga Waka and down at Otako, I would always try and simplify those heavy theories to be like, so what on earth is this theorist talking about, and how can we write it and describe it in a way that makes sense and resonates with our own upbringing? Because if it doesn't, and if you can't simplify it in that way, then there's no, do you really understand what that theory is saying? But also you're doing, a disservice to our rangatahi who are learning, because if they don't understand, the potential mana in those theories, then it can be a bit of oariaki, a bit of a futile attempt at that. But that is what, that kind of, when you talk about those collective ways of working, and yes, that's always a way that I've been taught to work growing up, with Mum and my whānau, in as much as, I see that working at university. And I loved when I would simplify, or, I'd work really hard and try and figure out what all those theorists were talking about, and then talk about it in a way that my students would understand. And using metaphors as a way to describe that often works. And, that's a tried and true method, not just in Te Ao Māori, but in other indigenous communities in the world. And that's, for me, was a way of being like, so that's what they're talking about here. Think about it in this kind of way, through this kind of metaphor, because again, that's a kia ngāwari te reo, make it easy to understand.
So true. That is so true. We were talking off air earlier about that I'd submitted my doctorate, and I still couldn't tell you what an epistemology is. I mean, I know people say it's like the study of nature and origin and limits of human knowledge and all that kind of thing, but I still don't really understand what that means, which is, by the way, why I wrote the doctorate in Te Reo Māori. Hopefully in a ngāwari enough fashion.
Absolutely. And that's actually the key point of what I'm writing Whose Knowledge Counts on, because epistemology deals with the question of whose knowledge counts. It comes from it's a Greek origin kupu. Yeah. Yes, but it's talking about, so what knowledge systems, what ways of knowing are valorized or are made real at the expense of others, because that's always where that tension is. And that's a core part of what I'm writing about in Whose Knowledge Counts. But exactly, it's you are talking into that space by e tuhiana i te reo rangatira. By writing in te reo, you are speaking into that space of validating a certain way of knowing through te reo.
I haven't asked you half the questions I was meant to ask you, actually. No, I haven't. Because, you've kind of guided me into certain things that all of a sudden you start getting those light bulbs going ping and going, oh, what does that mean? Oh, actually, what about this? So I want to thank you for that, and I apologise for not being able to get to half the things I wanted to talk about. Did we? No, we did mention that you are doing the residency. So hey, one mention is better than none. We meant to spend the whole interview on that, but anyway, maybe we can get you back for part 2 at some stage. Absolutely. I wish you all the best with the mahi. And thank you so much for your time. It's been really interesting, and I think there's a lot that people can take out of your experience, your academic approach, but also the mahi that you're doing. So, e te taukita kia kaha i roto ngā mahi tēnei ka mihi atu kia koe.
Tēnā koe hoa, tēnā koe.
Kia ora maira. That was Tākuta Pounamu Jade Aikman. E te iwi, we are now fast approaching the end of our show. My thanks to our producer, Tama, for producing the show, and also to Cam as well, who is our engineer. Join us next week. We will have much more as we start to wind down 2024. We're going right up until the end. We're going right up until the end of December, aren't we? Or Christmas. So bear with. E kia ana te kōrero, ko te toka i Ākiha, he toka whitianga rā, ko te toka i Māpuna, ko tāua ki te ai, ko te ripokau. Ti he wa Māori ora. Kia tātou katoa.